Last time I talked about how while destruction factions normally do better in 1v1 than in multiplayer free-for-all, the extra actions from duels cause Cowboys to have the opposite preference. They would rather play multiplayer free-for-all than they would play 1v1, because this way they can avoid accidentally giving an extra action to Innsmouth T or something horrible like that. Well, there's one of the newer factions called the Luchadors has the same issue, even stronger, at least so far. These are very, very early numbers, but the effect is so clear that even this early, they still mean something significant, which is that Luchadors are a heck of a lot better with more players in the game. Even though they're an interactive faction that can destroy or disable opposing minions. These two cards, I'm holding on to a Disable and a Destroy, which, since you're destroying one minion per opponent in a 2-player game and a third of a minion per opponent in a 4-player game, factions that do this should be better in 2-player normally. Well, the Luchadors suffer from the issue that they set these up by playing actions on opposing minions. In a multiplayer game, you have the Cowboys effect where you can put those actions on minions belonging to the opponent who is least able to move away from active bases, sacrifice their own minions for gain to get rid of the setup action, or straight up disenchant the setup action. And so you'll be able to make your setups a little more sticky by picking and choosing your targets. But on top of that, in a 4-player game, you're one of 3 opponents to whoever you put your setup action on, which makes getting rid of the setup not a huge priority. And in a 1v1 game, you are the only opponent, which means that against you, surprisingly enough, Heavy Drinker can be a power card. When it comes to playing well with and against the Luchadors, there are really 4 cards I want to talk about. 3 of them are the setup actions, and the 4th one is your best card relative to slot in the Luchadors faction. I'm talking about Caparoja. Obviously, this card single-handedly turns the Luchadors into at least a soft apes counter, if not a hard one, because Baboom has printed power 3 or less. So does First Mate if the apes have paired with pirates. But on top of that, in 1v1 games, Caparoja frequently allows the Luchadors to solo a base at one point during the game, denying their opponent second place points, which in many cases can turn out to be a 2 victory point difference for their opponent. And it can make winning 1 base plus wiping out the opponent's minions equivalent to the opponent winning 2 bases where you had minions. And so anytime you're playing against the Luchadors and you're thinking that they might be able to break a base next turn, you have to take into account the fact that their 4 allows them to wipe out 1 minion with printed power of 3 or less, which means that you frequently need 2 minions instead of 1 for safety, or you need a minion with printed power 4. Or, of course, if you have an indestructible minion, that also works well. Just watch out for reversal. Their other way to attempt to solo a base is through reversal, but this typically requires a setup action. Actually, this absolutely requires a setup action in play. So with that, I want to go to the setup actions. As the Luchadors, you have 3 options for setup actions, and your 2-power minion will search your deck for a setup action, or your discard pile, and place it into your hand, which means that frequently, since you've got 4 copies of Yellow Demon, you're going to be wanting to pick and choose which setup action you look for. In most situations, in more situations than either of the others, Quick Setup will turn out to be the best individual setup card. Your 2 power-generating actions, Cheap Pop will generate 4 power, if a minion there has a setup action on it. Tag Team plays you an extra minion, which is frequently going to be 4 or 5 power, since Flor Loca turns into a 5 if another player's minion has one of your actions on it. And so both of those are going to be capable of generating more power with the extra action from Quick Setup than Powerful Setup would generate in most cases. Yes, you can get 4 power out of Powerful Setup, but usually by the time you're getting 4 power out of a +1 to all your minions card, you should probably have already broken that base, or one of your opponents might have. On top of that, Quick Setup will also combine into a pin to just directly remove a minion from relevance in one turn without having to generate an extra action somewhere. Or Quick Setup turns out for the count into a destroy a minion card that requires no additional setup besides the Quick Setup that gave its own action playback. Whereas if you use Powerful or Smart Setup, you spent an action to do that and you have to wait until next turn to do something nasty to the opposing minion. On top of that, the Luchadors really like to be able to do stuff this turn because, especially in 1v1, opponents may often go to great lengths to get rid of a minion with a setup card on it. And Smart Setup and Powerful Setup are both vulnerable to the opponent getting a chance to react before you play pin or play out for the count, or possibly just before you break the base and actually take advantage of Powerful Setup's +1 to all your minions bonus. There's 3 main ways to do this. The first is you can use a disenchant type effect to just remove the setup action from play. One problem with this is that Yellow Demon can return the setup to your hand. There's also an action, Señor Mucho Slam versus the monsters, that can put 1 action played on a minion back in your hand. Yellow Demon can just search for a different setup. Señor Mucho Slam, your boss, also brings an action back from your discard pile into your hand, and sort of also turns all your setups into quick setups, and your quick setup into an even quicker setup. Señor Mucho Slam, quick setup, get to play 2 actions from your other faction is a really nice base breaking trick that you've probably already spotted as soon as you opened the cards. But it's still worth noting that you actually have a way to double action rather than just extra action here. The second way of dealing with a setup action is to destroy the minion or return the minion on which the Luchadors played the setup in order to get rid of the setup action. In multiplayer, this is usually not a good idea unless the minion is also pinned. Or unless you happen to know that the Luchadors definitely have reversal in hand and you are definitely its target. In 1v1, it's frequently worth it, and like I said, Heavy Drinker becomes a power card against the Luchadors because you just play it, you play Heavy Drinker, you sacrifice whichever minion the Luchadors set up on. This gets rid of the setup. You have 3 copies of Heavy Drinker in your deck, so you're going to get to do this 3 times without spending an action on destroying the setup. In addition, Heavy Drinker gets a power counter, which means that any action that gives you 1 power counters is enough to bring out the Vampire's Titan. This is actually... I've played Luchadors against Vampires in a 2-game match, and the Vampires kept doing this because it's really, really good against Luchadors. And the third option to deal with a setup is, if you notice, 2 of the setups care about the word here. After the first time each turn a minion is played here, each of your minions here gains +1 power. Both of those cards care about having the setup at a base where something is actually happening. So if you have access to movement cards, you can move the minions away from an active base that's likely to break to someplace less active and bring them back at a time when the Luchadors aren't going to get much benefit out of it. Or just move them away with the intention to sacrifice them later, so that the setup action never gets to do anything useful. I have also, against Luchadors, moved one of my own minions with quick setup on it to a ninja base and left it there for a long time in order to force the Luchadors to play the game without quick setup in their deck until they did something about that minion. This can be useful. I don't recommend doing this with more than 2 players in the game, but it's really, really funny to do to your opponent in a 2-player game when they suddenly realize that they're missing a key card from their deck. This works better after Out for the Count has already been used because of the added bit of regret from your opponent that if they just had Out for the Count, they would be able to deal with this. Of course, you can also do this to them twice, using their Out for the Count the first time, and then the second time exiling your minion to the middle of nowhere with quick setup on it and saying, okay, now outside of saying your Mucho Slam, there's going to be no more playing setup and a useful card in the same turn. So this is a lot of ways to deal with the setup action that have cost to the player who's dealing with the setup action. And since there's only one copy of Reversal in the Luchadors deck, and outside of Reversal, the minion with a setup action on it rarely turns into an actual problem for the player who got set up on, this means that with 3 or more players in the game, Luchadors typically won't have to deal with too much of this crap. But in 1v1, if you're playing against the Luchadors, you should make them deal with as much of this crap as you can possibly make them deal with. I find that in 3-player, for the most part, it seems to only make sense to use action removal to deal with the Luchadors action. And while this costs them tempos in terms of they have to spend a play bringing the action card back to their hand, and it means that they take longer to get where they're going, usually it just delays the Luchadors doing something good instead of prevents them from doing it entirely. And while, yes, you could start sacrificing your own minions left and right to slow down the Luchadors, in the case of a 3-player game, this is likely to king-make for the 3rd player at the table. When it comes to partner factions, I think the Luchadors might be fairly flexible in 3-player or 4-player games, but I don't really have the experience with them to be sure about that yet. However, in 1v1, I think I already have a definite preference. I would like to pair the Luchadors with an aggressive faction that wants to break bases and that puts significant threats on the board over and over again. Something like zombies, Innsmouth, robots, Ghost Tea, Mythic Horses, All-Stars, something that is going to attempt to kick the opponent's teeth in. Because if the opponent gets a chance to be really cute, they will busily set up in hand or set up at multiple different bases and get ready to use movement to move somewhere, or sacrifice their own minions to get a single power counter somewhere, or generally do all sorts of different complicated things in order to deny setup actions working in a useful way, which in the context of a 1v1 game can actually kind of stop the Luchadors from functioning as a faction. And when they're playing with Innsmouth, an opponent who attempts to do this ends up getting their teeth kicked in by Innsmouth while they're busy trying to demonstrate that they are excellent at stopping the Luchadors. In addition, since they need 2 defenders rather than 1 because of the threat of Caparosia removing a single defender at a base and allowing the Luchadors to solo that base, the opponents have actually even less time to advance their own plans while defending from something like an Innsmouth or Zombies Rush than they would against a lot of more control-ish opponents that you can pair with that Rush faction. Typically, if you're using something like Pirates or Ninjas, you will sometimes have to use an action play to remove that defender, and you will certainly remove the defender before checking to see if the base breaks. Caparosia does not abide by those restrictions. Caparosia just drops 4 power, lets you retain your action play to do something else aggressive, and at special speed after the base breaks, then removes that defender. And this is the hook you want to build your Luchadors deck on. The you don't have time to get cute against me because my partner faction will hit you really hard hook. I have tried Luchador Grannies. It is an absolute disaster. Do not ever try it, but there are a lot of factions in the game that are absolute disasters when played with Grannies. I have yet to pair Luchadors with a high-end control faction in 1v1, but I really think if you're going to pair Luchadors with control faction, that control faction needs to have some sort of alternate victory point, route to victory, so that setting up in hand doesn't just avoid the problems that the Luchadors present. Aliens will be just fine with Luchadors, most likely, because Invader Solitaire doesn't care if the opponent is trying to get cute. Actually, Invader Solitaire does care that the opponent is trying to get cute. Invader Solitaire loves it when the opponent gets cute. Dragons, similarly, will probably work fine. They can slowly build up ruins and power on a base and say, this base is breaking eventually, whether you like it or not. And if you dodge the setups too much, yeah, since you're trying hard to break one of the other two bases in play, you're not going to be able to avoid me doing stuff with setups. One thing I will suggest you to look out for with partner factions in multiplayer is that in a draft setting, you can use the fact that Caparosia counters the apes less than Tinks does, but still by a significant amount, to pull off the ape fairies trick in a draft. The way you do this is you draft fairies, or in this case Luchadors, a little bit earlier than its strength in most setups would justify it, in a situation where apes wouldn't normally drop to your second pick, but with the Luchadors in play, or the fairies in play, the apes are vulnerable enough to getting screwed by minion-based removal that the apes can actually drop to your second pick. And this is something you should look out for in a 3 or 4 player draft. If you can see apes and Luchadors together, you want to grab the Luchadors relatively early and either make someone else's apes vulnerable or grab the apes for yourself at a steal on a late pick when you shouldn't be able to get them anymore.